Garrett. There is a document Jung wrote in 1946, a clinical study. Not a theory, not a philosophical essay. Actual case notes from 40 years of sitting across from patients and watching what happens between two people when one of them believes they are deeply known. And what he found in that document changes something very specific about what you thought happened in that relationship. Darian, it tells you something exact about what the narcissist was actually doing when they said they knew you. Tim, I'm going to stop you right there. Are we really framing this as the narcissist never truly knowing someone? Because that sounds like philosophical scaffolding around regular heartbreak. People hurt each other. People fail to understand each other. That's just what humans do in relationships. That's not a Jungian mechanism. That's Tuesday. Darian? It's not about failure. It's about a mechanism Jung documented clinically. And there is a precise difference between someone who tries to know you and falls short, and someone who was never invested in the real you to begin with. Tim, what difference? Darian, he wasn't loving you. He was loving his own projection, the image he needed you to be. And those are not the same thing. Tim, that is a strong claim. Garrett, it is. And Jung had 40 years of case files to back it up. Stay with me here. Garrett, before we go any further, if this kind of conversation is landing for you, subscribe. Because what we're about to get into goes several layers deeper than what most people talk about when they talk about narcissistic relationships. There's something specific I want you to understand by the end of this. Something that holds two truths at the same time, the devastation and the liberation. Both real. Both happening simultaneously. You're going to want to hear where this goes. Garrett. Here's something I keep coming back to from my years in hospice care. I spent a long time sitting with people in the final weeks of their lives, and one of the things you see in that work, one of the things nobody really prepares you for, is what happens to the people who loved them, the ones left behind. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you would see something in a husband or a wife that didn't look like grief the way you'd expect it to look. It looked more like confusion, almost like disorientation, like they were sitting with someone they suddenly didn't recognize. Not because the person was dying, but because the person dying had finally stopped performing, had finally stopped being who the relationship required them to be. And the partner, who had been present for 30 or 40 years, had no idea who the real person actually was. Darian? And that's exactly what Jung was documenting in CW16, The Psychology of the Transference, 1946, Princeton University Press. He called projection one of the most common psychic phenomena in intimate human relationships. When we don't fully know someone, when there are gaps in our understanding of who they actually are, our unconscious mind fills those gaps. It takes its own material, its own images, its own fears, its own wishes, and it stamps them onto the other person. We don't know we're doing it, but we are doing it constantly in every relationship we have. Tim, but that's not unique to narcissists. That's just how relationships begin. You fall in love with an idea of someone. You idealize them. You see what you want to see. And then, over time, you actually get to know the real person, and the idealization fades. That is not pathology. That's just how attraction works. Every person in every relationship starts with projection. Darian, right? That's healthy projection. And here's the distinction Jung made that almost no one talks about. Healthy projection withdraws as you actually learn the person. As you experience their real reactions, their real needs, their real contradictions, the ways they surprise you and disappoint you and confuse you and delight you, the projection recedes. Slowly, the real person replaces the image. You stop loving who you needed them to be and start loving who they actually are. The projection gives way to knowledge. That transition is what intimacy is. Tim, so with a narcissist, the projection just takes longer to withdraw. It's slower. The idealization phase extends. Darian, it doesn't withdraw. Tim, what do you mean it doesn't withdraw? Darian, with a narcissist, the projection never recedes, because the narcissist is not interested in the real person. Jung wrote it directly in the Transference study. The lover loves his own projected image, not the real person. The gap never fills with actual knowledge of who you are. The projection is not the beginning of the relationship. The projection is the entire relationship. Tim, you're telling me that someone can be in a relationship for years, in some cases for decades, and never actually be curious about who the other person is? Darian, not just incurious, actively resistant to the reality of the other person. Because every time the real person shows up, every time they express a need that the projection didn't assign to them, or an opinion that contradicts the image, or a reaction that doesn't fit what the narcissist required, it doesn't land as information. It lands as a disruption. Something to be corrected. Tim, okay, I hear the theory, but I need the evidence. Because that is a very specific claim about what's happening inside someone else's psychology. How do we actually know the narcissist's investment was never in the real person, Darian? The Journal of Analytical Psychology published research in 2025 documenting what they called incomplete conjunctio. Researchers analyzing the narcissistic relational pattern found that the narcissist is seeking fusion, not connection. What they want is a mirror, something that reflects back what they need to see about themselves. And a mirror, by definition, is not a person. A mirror has no interiority of its own, no needs of its own, no reality that exists separately from the one looking into it. Tim, a mirror has no interiority. Darian, and the moment the mirror starts showing something other than what's needed, the moment the person behind the mirror asserts their own reality, the relationship becomes untenable. Not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped being a useful reflecting surface. Tim, okay, I hear that. I want to push back on one thing, though. I still think there is a real difference between someone who fails to update their image of you over time, who loves you but keeps seeing you as you were 10 years ago, and someone who is categorically never interested in who you are. Those are not the same failure mode. Darian, they're not. And that's the exact distinction Jung drew. Healthy projection. As knowledge grows, projection recedes. Narcissistic projection. Knowledge is actively prevented from growing. The narcissist doesn't just fail to update. They resist any update that contradicts the image they need you to be. New information about who you actually are isn't welcomed. It's managed. It's redirected. It's argued away. Tim, the image they need you to be. Garrett, not who you are, who they need you to be for their own psychological stability. There's a woman I remember from hospice. She had been with her husband for 42 years, and in the last months, when she was getting scared and angry and saying things she'd never said out loud in 4 decades, he didn't know what to do with her. Not because he didn't love her. I don't think that was it. But because he had spent 42 years with the version of her that the relationship required, and when that version finally gave way to her actual self, the frightened, complicated, real person, he was essentially meeting her for the first time. And it was too late. Tim, that's not a narcissist. That's just someone who never did the work of knowing their partner. Garrett. Right. That's exactly right. And what makes the narcissistic version distinct is this. In that hospice case, the failure of knowing was about neglect. About 2 people who were busy living their lives and never went deep enough. With a narcissist, the failure of knowing isn't neglect. It's structural. The knowing was never the goal. The image was the goal. Tim, okay, I'll grant that that is a different thing. Darian? But here's what I started to say and didn't finish yet. When the image finally starts to break, When the projection becomes unsustainable because the person underneath it refuses to keep performing it. Tim, wait. Before that, I need to understand something first, because you keep talking about the image and the projection, and I want to make sure we're being honest about what the empath was actually doing in all of this, because there are two people in a relationship. If the narcissist was projecting an image, the empath was... what? Cooperating with it? Performing it? Garrett. That's the right question, and the answer is more complicated than it sounds. Darian, hold on to where I was going. I'm going to come back to what happens when the projection breaks. But answer Tim's question first, because it matters. Garrett. The empath in that relationship was doing exactly what any person in a high-intensity relationship does when the emotional stakes are extreme. Adapting. When someone is extremely warm and focused on you in the beginning, and then withdraws that warmth when you stop fitting the image they need, you learn very quickly what keeps the warmth there. You learn what version of yourself produces the response you need, and you start optimizing, not because you're dishonest, not because you're weak, but because the emotional feedback system in the relationship is conditioning you to perform a specific role. Tim, that's operant conditioning with intimacy as the reward. Garrett. Yes, with unpredictability built in, which makes the conditioning even stronger. You don't have to be conscious of it. It happens. Tim. So the empath wasn't choosing to perform a false self. They were being shaped into one. Garrett. Over time, yes. And here's what the Journal of Psychology and Therapy found in 2024, when they studied the psychological effects of relationships with people with narcissistic personality disorder. Partners described, consistently across every account they studied, the feeling that the image required of them was incompatible with their real identity. Not in a few cases, in every case, as a baseline condition of the relationship. Tim. So every person in every one of those relationships felt that there was a required image and a real self, and those two things were in tension the entire time. Garrett, every one of them. Tim, and most of them would have named that feeling as, I'm not enough to be loved as I actually am. Darian, which is precisely wrong. The problem was never that the real self was insufficient. The problem was that the real self was never the target. And that distinction between I am not enough and I was never looked for is everything. Tim, one interpretation is self-condemnation. The other is a structural fact about the relationship. Garrett, yes. Tim, okay. First crack, I'll give you that. Darian, now. Back to what I was saying before Tim interrupted. When the projection finally becomes unsustainable, when the empath stops performing, or the relationship ends. Garrett. And this is where the conversation changes levels. Because we've been talking about what the narcissist was doing, now we need to talk about what that means for the person on the other side. And I want to introduce something specific here, something I haven't mentioned yet, that explains why the empath often doesn't realize what's happened until years after the relationship ends. Darian, the double invisibility. Garrett, say more. Darian, the empath is invisible to the narcissist. That's what we've established. But the empath also becomes invisible to themselves. Because when you spend years optimizing yourself for an image that was never yours, suppressing the parts of yourself that disrupt the projection, you lose track of where the performance ends and the real person begins. The two layers blur. You start to believe the performance is you. And the real you, the one with needs and opinions and reactions that don't fit the image, starts to feel like the problem. The deviant signal. The thing that needs to be controlled. Tim. So the damage isn't just relational, it's epistemic. You stop knowing who you actually are. Darian, which is why, in the research on recovery, the first major milestone isn't, I no longer miss him. It's, I can distinguish what I actually think and feel from what I was conditioned to perform. Garrett. And I can tell you from the people I worked with in hospice, not in narcissistic relationships, But in any relationship where someone spent decades inside a role that wasn't fully theirs, that process of rediscovery is one of the strangest human experiences there is. Because you're not discovering something foreign. You're rediscovering yourself. And it comes back in fragments. A preference you'd forgotten. A reaction you'd suppressed so long it surprises you when it shows up. An opinion you'd muted so completely you'd started to believe you didn't have one. Darian Sam Vaknin, who has written the most documented clinical analysis of narcissistic personality structure, describes it this way. The narcissist does not invest in the reality of the other person. What the narcissist invests in is the supply, the validation, the attention, the emotional regulation that person provides. And the object of that investment is replaceable the moment it stops providing what's needed. Not because the person did something wrong, because the investment was never in them. It was in the function they served. Tim, he was in a relationship with a function. Darian, 8, a function. And when you understand that, the question you have to ask is, if he was in a relationship with a function, what were you doing all those years? Tim, performing the function. Garrett. And I want to be careful with that word, because performing can sound like complicity. Like the empath was making a calculated choice to be fake. And that's not what this is. There's a difference between adapting to someone who actually sees you, which is what happens in real relationships. You make room for each other, you grow together, you change, and performing for an image that was never yours to begin with. When you adapt to someone who actually knows you, you're still visible throughout the adaptation. When you perform for a projection, you are invisible. Your real self is absent from the relationship. Hidden. Kept off stage. Tim invisible in a relationship. While someone is telling you they love you. Darian. While someone is telling you they love you. Yes, because what they love is the performance, the role, the function, and the moment you step out of the role, the moment the real you shows up, the one with contradictory needs and inconvenient opinions and genuine reactions that don't fit the image, something changes. The warmth cools. The attention shifts. You can feel it. You just can't name it. Tim, and most people reading that feeling back to themselves named it as, I did something wrong. I need to get back into the role. Garrett? And so they do. And the cycle repeats. Because the relationship is not at its foundation between two people. It's between a person and their own performance of an image. Tim, I'm getting more uncomfortable. But I need to keep pushing. Because there's something I haven't been able to address yet. You're describing a relationship in which the empath was essentially invisible, their real self absent from the entire dynamic. But the people who came out of these relationships describe the opposite experience, at least at the beginning. They describe feeling more seen than they had ever felt in their lives, more understood, like someone finally knew them. How do you account for that? Because it can't both be true. That they were invisible, and that they felt profoundly seen. Garrett. That is the right question, and the answer is what makes this the most disorienting layer of the whole thing. Darian. The feeling of being known was real. The knowing wasn't. Tim, unpack that. Garrett. When someone reflects your own unconscious material back at you, when they seem to understand your deepest needs, your most private fears, the things you've never said out loud to anyone, it can feel exactly like recognition. Like, finally, someone sees me. But what you're actually experiencing in those moments is something more specific. It's your own material, completing a loop. The narcissist in the early stage is gathering information, learning what you need to hear in order to feel seen, and then they give it back to you. But what they're reflecting isn't you. It's your own longing, amplified and returned. The feeling of being known comes from your own psyche, not from any real knowledge on their part. Tim. So, the certainty I felt, the sense of this person finally gets me, was actually my own needs being reflected back at me, not evidence that someone actually understood me. Garrett, yes. And the more intense the feeling of recognition, the more precisely the image was built. The certainty wasn't evidence of how well they knew you. It was evidence of how effectively the dynamic was working. Tim, the more convinced you were, the more thoroughly you were inside the projection. Darian. And here is where something shifts permanently once you understand it. Jung wrote that in healthy relationships, the intensity of feeling in the beginning, the electricity, the "I've never felt this before" quality, gradually gives way to something quieter and more real as actual knowledge of the other person grows. The projection fades and the person emerges. That transition is a natural part of intimate development. In relationships with narcissists, that transition never happens. The intensity either maintains itself through escalating performance, or it escalates into conflict and control when the performance starts to fail. But the knowledge never grows, because there was never anyone looking. Tim, there was never anyone looking. Darian. And now here is what James Hillman described. And this is the part I've been building towards since we started. Hillman studied directly with Jung, and he said that when a genuinely individuated person stops performing the projection, when they simply begin to exist as themselves, as an autonomous subject with their own interior reality, Tim, what happens? Darian. The narcissist experiences it as existential threat, not disappointment, not frustration. Existential threat, because an autonomous object, a person who exists with their own interior life, their own perspective, their own reality, independent of the projection, destroys the projection simply by being real. You cannot maintain an image of someone over a real person who is visibly, undeniably, present as something different from the image. Tim. So when the empath stops performing, when they finally stop shrinking, stop suppressing, finally say, "This is who I actually am." Darian. The narcissist doesn't respond with curiosity, with genuine interest in who this person is. They respond with the need to reinstate the image, to correct the deviation, to discipline the mirror back into reflecting what it's supposed to reflect, or, if that fails, to leave and find someone else who will hold the image in place. Tim. And the end of the relationship, the collapse of it, wasn't about the empath failing. It was about the projection becoming impossible to maintain. Darian. The collapse was about the end of the projection, not about you. Garrett. And here is where the two truths live. And I want to say this carefully, because the devastation is real. I'm not going to minimize the devastation. The recognition that in all those years, with all that claimed intimacy and all those moments where you felt finally seen, no one was actually looking at you. That is genuinely devastating. That grief deserves its full space. I'm not asking you to rush past it or reframe it into something more comfortable. But, Garrett. There is something on the other side of that devastation that is also true. And both things are true at the same time. This is the part that's hardest to hold. Darian, Jung described the withdrawal of projection, the moment when you see through the image to the mechanism that produced it, as one of the most disorienting and most liberating moments in psychological development. Disorienting, because the loss is real and the confusion is real. Liberating, because it tells you something precise about where the damage actually lives, and where it doesn't. Tim, where doesn't it live? Garrett. If the narcissist was never invested in the reality of who you are, If the relationship was built entirely on a projection, on a function, on a performance, then your actual self, the one underneath the performance, the one who had real needs that were never asked about, real fears that were never held, real opinions that were never genuinely heard, real dreams that were never met with authentic curiosity, that person was never in his hands. Tim, Garrett, he never reached her, not once, in all those years. Every time he thought he was knowing you, he was knowing the image, and the image was not you. Darian, the damage from the relationship is real. The exhaustion of the performance is real. The years of suppressing yourself are real. But your identity, the self underneath all of that, survived him not because you were strong enough to protect it, but because he never actually located it. He was looking for the mirror, and you were always somewhere else entirely. Tim, let me stay here for a second, because I've been the skeptic in this conversation, and I need to name what's happening to me right now. At the start of this, I said the Jungian framing was philosophical scaffolding around ordinary heartbreak. I want to take that back, because the mechanism changes what the grief is about. Garrett, say it. Tim, the grief I thought was about losing him, losing the relationship, losing the years. That grief is real, but underneath it, there's a different grief, a stranger grief. Grief for a recognition that never happened, for a knowing that was always an illusion. That's not ordinary heartbreak. Ordinary heartbreak means someone saw you and chose to leave. This is something else. This is realizing that the recognition you thought you finally had, you never had it. You were alone the whole time, in a relationship designed to feel like the end of loneliness. Darian and the Journal of Analytical Psychology research from 2025 called this exactly. They documented what survivors describe as double grief. Grief for the relationship and grief for the illusion of being known. And the illusion grief, they found, is in many ways harder to process, because grief for something real has an object. You know what you lost. But grief for something that was never there, grief for a recognition that never happened, has no object. It's like trying to mourn the absence of something that should have been present but wasn't. The shape of what's missing is felt but can't be pointed to. Tim, the shape of what's missing. That's exactly what it is. Garrett. And here's what comes after that grief. When survivors could finally draw a line between what the narcissist needed me to feel and their own actual thoughts and feelings, when they could look at a reaction they had in the relationship and say, that came from the performance, not from me. That was the marker in the UNASA research of real recovery beginning. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of distinction. I am this. The performance was that. And I am still here. Darian. One is a failure of care, the other is an absence of witness, and those two griefs are not the same. They don't heal the same way. They don't even have the same object. Tim, someone who failed to care, they were there. They saw you. They made choices. That grief has a target. This grief has no target, because no one was there to make choices about you. You were grieving the absence of a witness who never showed up. Garrett. And here's the callback I've been waiting to land. Do you remember what you said at the very start of this conversation? You said, that sounds like philosophical scaffolding around regular heartbreak. Regular heartbreak. Tim, I said that. Garrett. What you meant, what most people mean, is that the hurt is the same, just described differently. But what the mechanism tells us is that the hurt isn't the same at all. Regular heartbreak. Someone saw you and chose differently. This. No one ever looked, and those two experiences require completely different things to heal. Because one asks, what do I do with being left?